I think all our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends, I think they're all insane, but I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that. That's what's insane about it.
This will probably be the most important video I'll ever put forth on this channel, as it details its core concepts and lays out the main premise. The Western world is collapsing, and will do so within our lifetimes. Today, I will explain why I believe this is the case. Before we get started, I need to make several things clear. 1. Everything I will say is based on my interpretation of verifiable facts. I'll include links below which will allow you to verify these facts for yourself, and you're free to come to different conclusions, but I would urge you strongly to do so solely based upon facts and not on your opinion. This video is modeled after several long articles which you can read on my website, escapingthewest.net, and because there is no freedom of speech in the West anymore, I've had to edit the contents of the video and omit several words and phrases. If you want the full, uncensored version of this content, check out the website or buy my book. Even so, several topics mentioned in the video are deemed controversial by a supposedly free society, so if you're at all easily offended, do us both a favor and just stop watching right now. And finally, if you're interested in this kind of content, interact with the channel in the usual manners. It helps a ton. Let's get started because there's a lot to be said about this topic. The vast majority of Westerners are unaware of the impending sword of Damocles suspended over their heads. They watch the news and may have noticed that things aren't exactly going well, but when are they ever? Surely the rising civil unrest will subside again. Surely this wave of mass economic and cultural immigration will grind to a halt, and the millions of refugees will not always remain a burden on our countries. Surely the towering debt every single Western country is currently sporting will fix itself, somehow. Surely the unimpeded mass printing of money will not completely tank the economy, bring about massive inflation, or render the savings of millions of people worthless. Surely this cancel culture and slow but definite erosion of freedom of speech and civil liberties, the bedrock of Western civilization, will reverse itself and everyone will come to their senses. Surely the increase in armed police forces and the resulting brutality is just a temporary measure and will decrease eventually. Surely the vilification of white heterosexual men will stop. Surely this heavy political polarization and the accompanying issues will cease instead of escalate even more. Surely the apparent weakness of the Western world will not be obvious to strong and hostile foreign nations such as China and Russia, prompting them to take more and more brazen and open action. Every single scenario I somewhat mockingly described might resolve itself. That's true. Everything might be fine. It's true that not a single one of the multiple time bombs threatening the West might explode and cause an actual descent into a precipice. In fact, a sudden collapse is probably the least likely of all possible scenarios. A slow deterioration is much more likely, and like a frog that's been put in a slowly boiling pot of water, Westerners will slowly grow accustomed to every new normal, never realizing they're being boiled alive. An example of this would be the steadily more and more severe restrictions on personal freedoms governments have put on their citizens due to the virus which cannot be named, most of them temporary, for now, but some of which will never fully disappear. And because there's been a precedent now which didn't result in massive protests against the governments, these and similar restrictions will be easy to resurrect when the time comes to once again limit our freedom. Are we entering into a new dark age? There are some who say we are, and while you can certainly draw parallels between the first dark age and where we are heading now, I do not think it will go that far. But it can and will certainly get very, very uncomfortable for a lot of people. The Western world has been in steady decline for at least a few decades, but in the past several years it has been accelerating rather rapidly. It's hard to point at a single moment in time or at a singular event and say, that's where it started. That was the beginning of the end. Was it when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard? When people started and then kept electing the lesser of two evils? With the rise of social media and cancel culture, terror attacks, massive increase in debt, concurrent wars across the world, or the refugee crisis, none of those can be pointed out as the single cause of this situation, although they all definitely contributed. When will the West fully collapse? Nobody knows for certain. It most likely won't be tomorrow, next year, or even in the next 10 years, although it could. The West takes up a vast region of the world with very strong and old roots. It won't go down easily. Western society is probably the greatest achievement of mankind in many ways, which makes this collapse all the more tragic. It might go down definitively around 2040, 2050, but it's impossible to accurately predict because there are so many factors at play. What is likely, however, is that you and I, unless you are already pretty old, will see this collapse play out. It has, in fact, been declining for several decades now, and it looks like the West is on its last legs. Europe will almost certainly collapse faster than the US and Canada, but they won't be far behind. Is the West a decent place to live right now? In many ways, yes, of course, especially compared to shitholes like Afghanistan or North Korea. And for anyone coming from such countries, moving to the West is definitely an upgrade and a good idea. But that does not mean things are great for people currently living here. And it certainly doesn't mean the situation cannot escalate rather rapidly even more, turning the once great Western world into an economic and social debt trap, even more so than is the case right now. Will other countries not also collapse when the West falls? Those who are closely linked to the economy of the West will definitely feel its impact, but not nearly as much as the actual Western countries will. For example, do you think nations like Paraguay or the Philippines will be heavily affected when France or Germany goes down? They will hear about it, they'll shrug, and then they will get on with their lives. I've done my best to research this matter as thoroughly as possible, and from all the information I have gathered, the inevitable decline of the West can be attributed to roughly five major factors: an untenable economic welfare system based on debt, political polarization and civil unrest, mass immigration of barbarism, the death of civil liberties, the emasculation of society. Dozens of books could be written about any of these topics, and they are vastly complicated and complex issues. And hundreds of other, smaller factors are also at play. I'm not a fan of expounding ad infinitum, and you don't have time to plow through dozens of books or videos, so I'll do us both a favor and give you a brief overview of each of these factors and why they are so destructive. In the 3rd century BCE, the Romans started minting the aureus, which started off with a face value equal to the market value of the percentage of gold in it. As the years went by, however, increasingly incompetent and greedy rulers lowered the gold value in the coins, often severely. This money debasement led to inflation and economic chaos, which ultimately played a major part in the fall of the Roman Empire. Henry VIII, who ruled England in the early 16th century, was a notorious and reckless spender. To pay for all his luxury, wars, and wives, he started issuing coins with less gold and silver than was indicated on their face value. This is commonly called the Great Debasement, which led to huge financial trouble and upheaval in the country, mostly for the citizens. This destructive policy was revoked after he died, but the economic effects continued on for nearly a decade until all the debased coins were removed from circulation. After the devastating fallout of World War I, Germany foolishly continued and even expanded its massive welfare state program with a pension system, health insurance, veterans care, bailouts, lavish arts subsidies, and so on. This led to a huge demand for money, which had to be printed, which devalued the mark and led to runaway inflation. It destroyed the already hard-struck German citizens, bankrupted the middle class, and ultimately played a huge role in the rise and popularity of Adolf Hitler and his Nazis. And we all know how that turned out. Let's start with the most glaring and probably the most disastrous reason why the West is doing so poorly: money, or rather the lack of it. Historically, empires have been notoriously bad at managing their finances, and many of them have been led to their downfall by careless spending and improper financial management. Why do nations fall? Very often it's because their economies fail, which is the case right now. All Western countries are in debt, often massively so, and the cost of living is increasing at an unsustainable pace. At this moment, here's a rough estimation in US dollars of the national debt of the following countries. Those are frighteningly huge numbers, and they're increasing every year. The United States is by far the most indebted organization in the entire history of the world. While debt has indeed been a factor ever since its inception, the rapid growth and the sheer size of the current debt can and most likely will have a profound effect on its future. And what's worse, how can it ever get better? The economists in charge frequently seem to think that the way forward is to just keep on printing money, further diluting the already increasingly worthless currencies. This causes inflation, a hidden tax. Every year, the price of products rises slightly. Today, you might have to pay, let's say, $5 for a Happy Meal, but next year it could be $5.20. Chump change, you might say. But small, steady, and repeated increases become a huge problem after many years. Your money becomes worth less and less as the years go by. The purchasing power of a dollar today is a fraction of what it was decades ago, and it's going down, down, down. This is why people who save money are hit very hard by inflation. Saving money all your life, hoping to retire with a cozy nest egg, is currently a silly dream in most cases. Sure, you might amass a relatively large sum of, say, $1 million, which is still a considerable amount of money today, but will it still be in 20 to 30 years' time? I highly doubt it. Let's zoom in on the word retire and how flawed this concept is. First off, there's the philosophical aspect. Fully retiring is only for people who do not like what they do for a living. If you love what you do, why would you ever fully stop doing it? Sure, you can cut down on the amount of work you do, but why quit completely? Secondly, if you rely on a pension, a retirement fund, or whatever system your government or company has in place, you are betting your future on the goodwill, benevolence, and prosperity of your nation, which, as you can deduce from the premise of this video, is something that is very unlikely to be tenable in the future. The only security a government-funded retirement offers is an illusory promise to use other people's money to take care of you. Not a great plan by any means. Retirement funds are a massive expense for governments, and more people will start to dip into them. The average life expectancy goes up, so someone who is entitled to a pension will keep draining it for longer and longer periods of time. More and more people will need to work for more and more years of their life in order to keep the system going. But it's inevitably self-defeating, even if the younger generations will keep putting up with working more to pay for older generations. Money will be needed, money will be printed, and money will lose even more value. Welfare is a very nice utopian moral claim, a dubious triumph of Western prosperity and generosity for those less able and or less deserving, and it has gone way too far. Far too many people abuse the system and get paid for doing nothing. While this is definitely a big problem in the US, it pales in comparison to the pickle the more socialist European countries are in. Not only are their citizens receiving massive welfare packages for not working, for their retirement, for their children's upbringing and their healthcare. This monetary magnanimity extends to their come one, come all immigration policy. Randy, mad genius Gage put it this way: the perfect citizen for a government is a needy one, because the more you need the government, the more controllable you are. As a creative, thinking human being, you are up against a mass of people who want something for nothing, and governments around the world who want to give it to them. Welfare is a vicious cycle because the more people come to rely on the government's assistance, the more likely they are to vote for politicians who endorse welfare. These politicians will then have no choice but to cater to their base and keep the welfare system going. It cannot end. It gets worse every year, and even if the government tries to reduce the vast scale and disastrous impact of this system, it sometimes gets met with stubborn and short sighted resistance from the populace, like a drug addict whose quick fix gets taken away for his own benefit. For example, in November 2022, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Madrid in Spain to protest the government's potential privatization plans regarding their healthcare system. Instead of realizing that their current system was untenable in the long run and something had to change if the nation were to survive, people just wanted their free right to keep going. Long term consequences to their country be damned. Honestly, I'm not an economist, and I cannot explain the monetary crisis the West is heading towards much better than this. But there is plenty of research that backs up this rather pessimistic yet realistic view. Western governments are spending more money than they have or are able to squeeze from the taxpayers on wars, welfare, policing, and improving the world, global aid, and so forth. And thus, at some point, the entire system will crumble. And even if this massive debt bubble does not explode in our faces, can you really argue with these factual statements about Western economies? More and more people will be relying on some sort of welfare, be it in the form of pensions, ever expanding broad healthcare, or unemployment benefits. This welfare has to be funded somehow, and taxing the already overburdened taxpayers isn't even the worst outcome. Printing money is, because the large hyperinflation this will cause will be devastating for millions upon millions of people. Westerners are among the most heavily taxed people in the world. You might not realize this, but if you're an average employee in any Western nation, you are paying anywhere from 40 to 60% or more of your income in taxes, be it apparent or hidden taxes. Being forced to give the government half of the money you earn is absolutely ridiculous in my view. But for most Westerners, this is just a daily reality. They aren't aware of it, and even if they were, they do nothing about it. While they could. Western economies are, for the most part, stagnant or in a bubble. Yes, the S&P 500 has been steadily rising through every decade so far, but do you think this would still be the case without the help of the Federal Reserve? Bailing banks out by printing massive amounts of money to prop them up, to maintain the illusion of prosperity, while letting the average lower and middle class worker pick up the bill, is not my idea of a healthy economy. All of this points to the sobering fact that the West is long overdue for an enormous economic crash, the likes of which the world hasn't seen in a very, very long time, perhaps not ever. Sure, its economies might recover due to the same techniques that exacerbated the crisis, but the underlying issues will not go away, and it would only be postponing a much worse collapse later on. If you want more information on this specific topic, I would urge you to check out Ray Dalio's Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. I'll put a link in the description. On January the 6th, 2021, thousands of angry political fanatics stormed the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., where the House and Senate had gathered to certify the Electoral College votes of November 2020's presidential election. The current Republican president lost to his Democratic counterpart, and promptly claimed the election was rigged. He evoked his rabid fan base to take action, upon which thousands of them assaulted the once sacred capital. Approximately 140 police officers were criminally assaulted, of which one died and two committed suicide. There was an estimated $1.5 million in damage to the historic building. Politics is one of the most divisive topics you can imagine. Put two random people in the same room, and they could get along swimmingly on a variety of subjects. Even if they don't agree on everything, most people would be happy to agree to disagree on their differences. Before, we're talking about a few decades ago now, people from opposite sides of the political spectrum, whatever that still means, surely disagreed on many issues as well, but very rarely did these disagreements lead to violence, rioting, hatred, death threats, let alone the actual downfall of a nation. Concepts like democracy and the right to disagree without fear of repercussions were once inviolable in the West. Are they still? Let's start with the United States, where the division and vitriol between the left and the right has never been bigger. This is quite ironic, honestly, because they've actually never been more in tacit agreement on most large issues. Both sides favor a big, strong government, censorship, more taxes, suppression of the influence and freedoms of people whose opinions they don't agree with, and so on. Like Harry Brown put it, left wing politicians take away your liberty in the name of children and of fighting poverty, while right wing politicians do it in the name of family values and fighting drugs. Either way, government gets bigger and you become less free. It's not uncommon nowadays for couples to break up because of political differences, no matter how small, friendships to get ruined, people to receive death threats, credible or not, to get fired or cancelled, or just face massive public hostility for a difference of opinion. And that's all politics is, opinions. The civil and healthy way to handle points of view you disagree with, like, I think drugs should be legal, or abortion is a woman's right, is something like, okay, I disagree with your opinions, but we are both adults, so let's agree to disagree. We and similar minded people vote for whichever politician represents our interests and ideas the most, and we will abide by the results. Not, you disagree with me? Now you must die, or get fired, cancelled, protested against, or harmed. Of course, the best option would be to not get involved in politics whatsoever and leave the West behind so you aren't hindered by them or by the people who take this stuff very seriously. Yes, there has always been a division between political parties, and nowhere was this division more apparent than in the US with its ridiculous two-party system. But never has it been so extreme, with actual strong consequences in the daily life of many people. Several factors could be blamed here, such as Donald Trump, undeniably by far the most divisive president of the United States ever, no matter if you support him or not, cancel culture and political correctness. But as far as I can tell, the underlying culprit here are social media and the amplified echo chambers they create. This isn't the place to go into details about this issue, but social media are a cancer upon society, and their benefits do not outweigh their heavy costs, of which the extreme political polarization is only one element. Not only are the American people more divided than ever, their differences stray from the theoretical discourse more and more into the realm of actual action and violence. Just to name a few examples, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and the Proud Boys. These are all groups with strong and outspoken political beliefs, an expressed and unreasonable hatred towards the other side, and a tendency towards protesting, rioting, destruction of public and private property, and generally making the world a worse place, while accomplishing absolutely nothing of value. This is called civil unrest, and it will become more and more common for Americans to have to deal with regular rioting and vandalism, for whatever bullshit reason. And woe is you if you ever publicly disagree with the aggrieved rioters. A side effect of this growing unrest and violence are increasingly armed police forces. Gone are the days when a town's safety could be managed by a few police officers with some handguns. Nowadays, police forces are sporting riot gear, automatic rifles, tear gas, water cannons, bazookas, and even tanks. They are basically turning into paramilitary forces, also known as militias. Do you think this will alleviate or exacerbate the current level of civil unrest among the population? For example, in 2020, hundreds of protesters took over entire city blocks in the city of Seattle for multiple days and dubbed it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, following violent clashes between protesters and law enforcement. This was part of the Black Lives Matter movement and came about in protest against police brutality against African Americans, calling for a defunding of the police. Another issue is the states part of the United States. In the political realm, it has always been a practice of labeling states either red or blue, denoting which political faction it predominantly votes for. But as the political chasm widens, several states could be making more and more noise towards secession from the country and going their own way. Currently, that's all this is, noise. As the years go by, however, it might turn into something more, and this is a possible scenario of how the collapse of the United States might play out. In Canada, political polarization and civil unrest are much less of a factor. Canadians are rather relaxed in that respect, and while there will always be outlying violent groups, it doesn't seem likely Canada will experience nearly as much civil unrest as the US will. But it isn't immune to it by any means. As an example, in early 2022, the country saw a series of protests against some pandemic restrictions, the so-called Freedom Convoy protests. This blocked vital trade routes with the US and dealt a significant blow to an already struggling economy. Europe, specifically the EU, on the other hand, could very well tear itself apart. Throughout 2022, most European countries have seen plenty of civil unrest and widespread protests against a myriad of issues, most prominently the rising cost of living, which isn't about to get better. On the political spectrum, while it isn't as bad as in the US with their two-party system, European politics seems to become ever more divided and full of vitriol for the other side as well. Even if we put aside the growing political unrest within countries, which is less extreme than in the US, but still very much present, we need only look at Brexit to catch a glimpse of the future. The United Kingdom separating from the EU was only the first big step towards its collapse. Currently, a few other countries are semi-seriously considering this move, such as Poland and Hungary, and in most other countries there are political parties advocating the split. Civil unrest in Europe is frequently politically motivated, and more often than not it has to do with the mass immigration of barbarism, an issue which I will have to talk about in the second part of this video. I'll put a link in the description once it's up. Thanks for watching this first part of why the Western world is collapsing. How do you feel about this topic? Do you agree with my points? Or do you think I'm just some jackass pulling nonsense out of my ass? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.